In the last lesson, we looked at equations and lines that went through the origin, but not all, and probably most of them, most of lines, don't go through the origin. They have these things called intercepts. And there are two intercepts. One is the x-intercept. And the x-intercept of a line is the x-coordinate of a point where the line crosses the x-axis. This occurs when y equals 0. So in this picture right here, this is the x-intercept because the y value is 0. When the y value is 0, you have the x-intercept. The reverse is true for the other one. The y-intercept of a line is the y-coordinate of a point where the line crosses the y-axis. It occurs when x equals 0. So this point right here is the y-intercept because it's where it's crossing the y-axis and the x value is 0. Finally, one more thing to learn, and then we'll do some practice. There's this equation called slope-intercept form. And it's called slope-intercept form because when you're written in this form, y equals mx plus b, the m stands for the slope, which we already knew, but the b stands for the y-intercept. Now, in the last lesson, we didn't have a number here because it was always 0. And when you have a 0, you don't put anything. But the b here is the same as the b here. So it's where it's crossing that y-axis. Slope-intercept form is written as y equals mx plus b, where m represents the slope and b represents the y-intercept. And I've got a cool song that I'll sing you next time we have class and I remember. So let's identify some slopes and intercepts. So we're just saying what m equals and what b equals. And remember, for the b, the x value is always going to be 0. And slope is always a fraction. So in the formula, y equals mx plus b, what number is in the slope spot? In this equation, y equals, y has to be by itself, is the negative 4 in the slope spot or is the negative 2 in the slope spot? Well, slope is always in front of the x. That's always where slope is. It never moves around. So the number in front of the x is negative 4. Since we have to write it like a fraction, I'm going to put negative 4 over 1. And the intercept, the number that's in the intercept spot, is negative 2 because it says plus b and this says minus 2. So the only way for that to be true is if b is negative 2. The sign travels with the number. In letter B, it doesn't say y equals. It says y minus 5 equals. So in order to do this, we have to drop a line and bring that 5 over, just like we did in chapter 1. Now, hopefully, you're not going to combine them because you can't combine a variable with a number, so you just write it as 3 over 2x plus 5. Now that we have it in that form, we can say what m equals, we can say what b equals. Remember, b always starts at 0, and slope is always a fraction. So the number in the slope spot, m, is 3 over 2. And the number in the intercept spot is positive 5. So you have to get it to say y equals if it doesn't already. Alright, so now let's actually graph. We have to graph the equation and y equals negative 3x plus 3, and then once we're all done graphing, we're going to identify the x-intercept. So let's make our xy grid. Please do your best to use a ruler. If you don't have a ruler, use a straight edge. You don't want your axes to be crooked. And there's my x. Now, back in the very first lesson, 4.1, we learned about how to graph a line using a table. But there's a much quicker way to graph a line that we learn about in this lesson. So the first thing that you want to do is plot the b value on the y-axis. And the reason that it's on the y-axis is because if you look at the previous example, the b value is the y-intercept. So it has to be on the y-axis. So let's plot z. So in this case, the b value is 0, 3. So let's plot the point 0, 3. The next step is to count m, which in this case is -3 over 1. And remember, m is the slope, so that's here, right in front of the x value. So then the question that you ask is, what does -3 over 1 mean? -3 in the numerator means to go down 3, and 1 in the denominator means to go to the right. So from 0, 3, not from the origin, from 0, 3, we're going to go down 3 and right 1, and we're going to land right here, so put a dot right here. And then the more points you have, the more accurate your line will be. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to go down 3 from this dot and right 1 and put a dot right here. So if I have more space, I can do it again. And then let's get a straight edge and make the line. Don't forget that the very last thing you want to do is write the name of the line on it. So on it somewhere, you're going to write y equals -3x plus 3. Now, once you get more skilled with this, it will take you under a minute to graph a line, whereas if you had to make a table, it might take you several minutes. The very last thing that we have to do for the directions is to identify the x-intercept. So the x-intercept is where it crosses the x-axis, just like the y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. So we're going to look on the x-axis and see where our line is crossing. And it's crossing right here. So what are the coordinates of this point right here? That's the point 1, 0. And in the next lesson, we're going to see a way to find the intercept without using a graph. But when you have a graph, you can just look and say, oh, it's crossing right here on the x-axis, and name that coordinate. All right, let's check out this kind of word problem down in example 3. The cost in dollars of taking a taxi X miles is y equals 2.5x plus 2. So first thing I want to do is I want to rewrite the slope as a fraction, because I always told you that slopes are better written as fractions, and the reason is that you can see the relationship between the y value and the x value more than you can as a decimal. So I'm just going to say 2.5 is the same, and I'm going to turn that into a fraction. 2.5 equals, well, that's the number 2.5. If you don't know what it is as an improper fraction, here's how you talk yourself through it. 2.5 is 2.5, and so that equals 5 halves. If you just want a refresher on how to turn a mixed number into an improper fraction, it's the denominator times the whole number, and then you add the numerator. So it's be 2 times 2 plus 1, that's 5, and you keep the denominator. If you want me to go over that, do a couple of examples, please ask in class. I'm not going to assume that you need the examples because that's from earlier grades. So now, in order to do part A, which is graph the equation, I need to know what the m is, which in this case I just calculated, that's 5 halves. And the b value is here at 0, 2. So I'm going to make a coordinate grid, but before I do that, I need to determine, does it make sense to be in all 4 quadrants? And it doesn't. Typically, word problems only belong in one quadrant because it doesn't make sense to have negative miles or negative dollars. So I'm going to make myself a big L, get myself only in quadrant 1, and now I can plot my points. First thing I do, if you look at the steps up here, are plot the b value. So first thing I'll do is plot the point 0, 2, and that's right here. The next thing you want to do, again, if you follow the steps up here, is to count the m. And so the slope is 5 over 2. Just as a refresher, that means to go up 5 and right 2. So from this point right here, I'm going to go up 5 and right, 2. And then I'll go up 5 again, right 2. Make your line, get a straight edge. Now don't put arrow tips down here because it doesn't make sense to go into the negatives. And let's write the equation. Y equals 2.5x plus 2. Last step, B, is to interpret the y-intercept and slope, and there's a little note down here. Do you remember what interpret means? Interpret means to explain. So you're going to explain in a sentence what 0, 2 means and what 5 over 2 means. So what does 0, 2 mean? Well, 0 stands for the x value, and x is miles. And 2 stands for the y value, and that's dollars. So what does 0 miles mean? Well, 0 miles means you haven't gone anywhere, and 2 means $2. So before you go anywhere in this taxi, you have to pay $2. If you've ever been to the city and you look on the side of the taxi cabs, it will typically tell you that there's a certain fee just to get into the taxi, and then it's a certain number of dollars per mile. And so that's what this is telling you. It's telling you that just before you get, when you get into the taxi, before you go anywhere, it's a $2 fee. The next thing that they want us to do is to interpret the slope. So the slope is 5 over 2. And I need to say what 5 over 2 means. So 5 has to do with the y value. Remember, in slope, the y is on the top, and so that stands for dollars, and 2 stands for miles. Now, the slope is constantly moving, right? I keep graphing the slope. So that means that for every two miles, you pay $5. So if you go 2 miles, you pay an additional $5. If you go 4 miles, you pay an additional $10. 3 miles will be $15. Every 2 miles, you pay $5. That's what the slope means. If you have any questions, write them down and ask me when you come to class.